Hello, and welcome to the first of my podcasts by way of news review. Merry Christmas, it's Boxing Day 2021. This first podcast might also be the last. We shall see how it goes, but the purpose of them is to interest and hopefully amuse you with a look at what's been in the papers. And we're going to start with a story in the Telegraph, which announces that the ban on selling champagne in pint-sized bottles is going to be repealed. They say, and I quote, a government source told the Telegraph on Thursday night, pint-sized bottles were a victim of the EU's war against imperial measurements, which are widely used and understood in this country. Now we've left the EU, we can rid ourselves of rules like this. Work is underway in government to make this change happen. Well, we welcome this, of course, for at least a couple of reasons. The first is that a pint is a much more useful measure for champagne than a bottle, a little bit smaller, just right for a quick glass of champagne for two people at lunch without champagne being left over. Or if you're going to drink a whole bottle, well, frankly, a pint is probably enough. So it's a more useful measure. But perhaps more importantly, who the hell do these people think they are, telling us how we can sell champagne, or for that matter, any other liquid, and mandating that it has to be certainly only in certain units? I do wonder whether it would have been lawful to sell bottles of 568 millilitres of champagne, but I'm not aware that happened. I'm going to probably more than once refer to the work of Professor Joseph Tainter, who in his seminal work, Collapse of Complex Societies, he identified the common thread as to why almost all civilizations in the world have collapsed so far, and the answer, it turns out, is complexity, which you might characterize as too many rules, too much tax, generally too much government interference. The government has absolutely no business telling us what size bottles we should buy our champagne in, or for that matter, anything else. So, good news story to start. Next we go to The Spectator and a piece by Johnny Patterson. The piece is headed "The Pillar of Shame and the Erasure of Hong Kong." It was posted or put up on The Spectator yesterday, and the opening paragraph reads as follows. In the dead of night, one of the most prominent memorials to the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Pillar of Shame, was removed from Hong Kong University this week. The 8-metre-high statue commemorating the thousands killed in Beijing's brutal crackdown on peaceful demonstrators in June 1989 was filmed being loaded into a container late on Wednesday night. This won't come as a great surprise to many of us. There were those who thought that when Hong Kong was returned to the Chinese Communist Party, that a two systems policy might be maintained for 50 years or so. I have to say, I thought that was never on the cards. It's really not conceivable that China would want within its own borders a westernized democracy. And whether you care or do not care about democracy, and lots don't, evidently, that was plainly something that was always going to happen and will continue to happen. And the remarkable thing is that so many people have remained in Hong Kong for as long as they have. Let's hope that they're all right for a while yet. Next we go to the BBC and a piece by someone called Marco Silva, who describes himself as climate change disinformation specialist. And the article is headed "Climate Change Small Army of Volunteers Keeping Deniers Off Wikipedia." The opening paragraph reads, "Wikipedia has for so long been plagued by climate change denial, but a group of dedicated volunteers around the world is working tirelessly to keep the deniers at bay. This is supposed to be a news piece, and it is clearly riddled with bias. It's perfectly proper to be sceptical about the claims of those who are alarmist about climate change. Time after time after time, we've seen that the predictions of the climate change alarmists have not come true. The finest climate scientists in the world have persistently pointed out the flaws in the IPCC predictions and government approaches to matters of climate change. So it's perfectly proper to be sceptical and to attempt to smear people who want to pursue a legitimate scientific inquiry into the science of climate change should not be castigated as deniers, a pejorative term, seeking to associate them with those who deny that the Holocaust, whereby the Jews were murdered by the Nazis during the Second World War. All nonsense, of course. The BBC is a disgrace on this topic, not to be trusted for one moment. Everything they say about climate change is predicated on the proposition that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and that everybody who challenges it is anti-scientific. It's hard to see that at least this part of the BBC should be funded by public money. Next we go to the Times and a piece by their political editor Caroline Wheeler under the heading "Keir Starmer opens up 8-point lead as Partygate takes toll on Tories." The first paragraph or so goes as follows. Labour has opened up an 8-point lead over the Tories after a punishing few weeks for Boris Johnson, a poll commissioned by the Sunday Times reveals today. Nearly 25,000 people were asked about their voting intentions, and the results give the first detailed insight into the public's perception of Johnson's handling of the sleaze scandals engulfing his party. The finding of a constituency-by-constituency poll conducted on December 1-21 suggested Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, would have won a general election with a 26-seat majority. Johnson would have lost his seat of Uxbridge and South Ruislip, the first sitting Prime Minister to have been ejected from Parliament. Well, that's just a poll, of course, and mid-term we all know that polls tend to veer towards opposition parties and back again to incumbent parties by the time of the next general election. But nevertheless, it is a significant straw in the wind for Boris Johnson, who has not been doing so well in the last few weeks. He was a good mayor of London, it seems. He was popular and got things done and was a success. He was plainly effective in terms of getting Brexit done. All of that is good. He's lost a lot of support from traditional Tory voters because his policies seem to be governed more by his wife than by the spirit of what Boris Johnson has said and written in the past. So he's losing from the right, and I think his grip on the left is evidently waning as well. It hasn't been helped, as the Times has pointed out, by the scandals about the hypocrisy of the government. Hardly surprising. COVID is a curious thing. One is bound to think that the politicians in charge must surely know that much of the scaremongering concerning COVID has been a beat-up. They do it because it is popular, not because they actually believe in it. If they actually believed in it, would they be having these parties behind closed doors? It's not clear. It's not just the Tories, of course. The images from the last Labour Party national conference show that they were equally hypocritical about this issue, but they don't seem to have suffered the same damage. Keir Starmer, of course, has been completely useless as a leader of the opposition, and the fact that he's now ahead of Boris Johnson speaks not so much to his appeal, but rather to disaffection of the general public with how Boris Johnson is getting on. Next we go to South Australia, where I live, and in daily reports that in South Australia there have been more COVID-19 cases. A piece by Thomas Kensall begins, "The Marshall government's plan to ease COVID restrictions on December the 28th has been postponed until next year, and South Australians have been urged to work from home for the next month in a bid to stop a surge in Omicron infections after another 688 COVID-19 cases were recorded today." These are very small numbers, of course, in South Australia and indeed in most parts of Australia. Ironically, but perhaps not surprising, the state which has had the most restrictions on life in Australia by far has been Victoria, which has also been the state which has had the worst record of controlling the virus. It's worth comparing the position with South Africa, where all COVID restrictions have apparently now been lifted, and it seems nobody is dying of COVID or even being hospitalised. South Australia, and indeed Australia as a whole, is interesting. It's got off pretty lightly. It does rather suggest that those doctors and scientists who point to vitamin D as a major factor in preventing COVID, or at any rate preventing it from being an illness, or at any rate a serious illness, may be right. There was evidence from homeless people in California, who obviously get a lot of sunshine, that they seem not to have been affected by COVID in the same way as people indoors. In Australia, it's worth noting, in Melbourne, they all wear black clothes and they stay indoors and don't enjoy the outside very much. That's the place that's been worst hit by COVID in Australia. So maybe there is something in that. The one COVID measure which does seem to work reasonably well in the short term is shutting borders, which plainly in the short term has the effect of slowing down the disease. Not a long-term solution, of course, unless you want to end up like Albania in the 1950s with an entirely closed society, at the end of which you'll have people with donkeys and carts rather than driving around in modern cars or enjoying any of the other advantages of modern civilized life. But some people would think that's pretty wonderful. I bet Greta Thunberg would think that's a pretty good solution, really. And it is interesting that the people who've been pushing for climate change alarmism are generally much the same people who have been pushing for COVID alarmism, all looking not just for things about climate change or COVID, but a change in world order. Anyway, be that as it may, Nicola Spurrier is the public servant who is in charge in South Australia. She is a curious person. There have been big queues in South Australia, which is after quite a while of just a handful of cases, if any, it now has a few hundred. Testing is being required, and the queues for testing have been up to 8 hours or so, as people sit in their cars waiting to get tested. She was asked about whether the government was really ready for this, and she said, no, we put in hand lots of preparation. And she said the reason that South Australia was having a problem testing its people is because South Australia has a small population. That's a curious thing to say. You'd have thought a small population was easier to test than a big population, but obviously not for Nicola Spurrier's way of thinking. Anyway, on we go. Life here on the Fleurieu Peninsula carries on very much as usual, and hopefully if Omicron continues to be as mild as the South African evidence is suggesting, we'll have turned the corner now, and the severe restrictions which have been seen elsewhere will never come here. Finally, in this episode, we're going to have a look at the Mail Online. They have a headline: Windsor Castle intruder armed with a crossbow who used a rope ladder to scale a metal fence is arrested while the Queen was inside ahead of Christmas celebrations with Charles, Camilla, Edward and Sophie. When you actually get down to the text, this might or might not be the case. what they say is, sources suggested that the man was armed with a crossbow and used a rope ladder to scale a metal fence, but the police refused to divulge exactly what he was carrying. So that may be just sheer speculation. Maybe he wasn't carrying a crossbow at all. Maybe he just clambered over an ordinary fence. Who knows? But anyway, bless her heart, Her Majesty seems to be absolutely fine. I do wish, by the way, that the BBC World Service would stop referring to her as Queen Elizabeth. She's not Queen Elizabeth. She's the Queen. Get it right. Perhaps that could be a message for them for the new year. Anyway, if you have been, thank you for listening to this first podcast, and we might or might not do some others. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your Christmas break. Thank you.